Hey guys, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here with a knife video for you, and today we're going to talk about sharpening your knife. You can see I've got a couple of knives here. This is the Medford 187, and the reason I've got this here is because you can see that edge very, very keenly. It has a real contrast between the primary and secondary bevel. The other knife I've got here is the Forge Ferrex, and it has the same issue because of this very attractive stonewash on the bevel. You can really see that edge. Okay, so I'm going to use these two knives as sort of an example to make some points. I do have some diagrams here with me. I will say this by starting off, this video is kind of for everyone. Okay, everybody that I know has some knives in their house and has to use knives on a regular basis for cooking, for working outside, for all kinds of different reasons. And so this video is going to be fairly general in its approach. I will say that, you know, if you've had and used knives for 100 years, you probably won't get much out of this video. But if you're new to knives, or if you have a lot of knives and they're terribly dull and you don't know what to do about it, you will hopefully appreciate this video. All right, now even if you are a real knife enthusiast and you've watched all my other videos and you have 100 knives at home and you keep them very sharp, you may pick up something here or there that's helpful. Hard to say. So first, let me start out by talking about what we're doing when we sharpen a knife, okay? So here's my, Medford 187. Let's suppose I go to cut something and it's very hard to cut. Let me show you that this knife is quite sharp now. That takes, there you go, you should probably see that hair coming off very, very easily. Okay, so this knife is very, very sharp, and I like to keep my knives quite sharp. This is D2 steel, by the way, and D2 steel does take an extremely keen edge fairly easily. Now, let me start talking first of all about what we're doing when we sharpen. I'm going to use a diagram to demonstrate this, okay? So, up here at the top, I've got my artist's rendition of a knife, okay? Here is the primary bevel, here's the secondary bevel, and by secondary bevel, we basically just mean the sharpened edge of the knife, okay? So if I use this knife to use that, so there's the primary bevel, there's the secondary bevel, that bright, shiny, sharpened portion that you can see there. You can do the same with the Forge here. There's the primary bevel, there's the secondary bevel, okay? So when we sharpen, of course, we are only dealing with that secondary bevel. We're not going to do anything with the primary bevel, and so you can see how this picture indicates. Here is the primary bevel, here's the secondary, and this we're going to assume is a nice sharp knife. On this side, though, we have what may not be a sharp knife. So here, instead, I've tried to represent this with a marker. It's not easy to do, but here I've sort of drawn the edge rounded off so that it's no longer terribly sharp. Here I've shown the edge where it's rolled, okay, so the very sharp edge of the knife has rolled over to one side, and here I've showed where it's flattened. It can also chip, but obviously I can't represent a chip in this direction very easily. So a chip would be if out of this edge here, there were like a little divot missing. So that's what can happen to your blade, and that's what necessitates sharpening it, okay? So now let's move down to the bottom picture and talk about what we mean by sharpening. So when we sharpen, here's, we're imagining we've zoomed in on the secondary bevel, okay? So remember that from before, that's this angle here. So we've zoomed in on the secondary bevel, and all we're gonna do when we sharpen is remove a little bit of material off each side to restore this. Use this knife as a pointer to restore this perfect, pristine edge. All right, so that means we're going to have to remove this material somehow, and generally speaking, we're going to use some kind of abrasive method, right? So we're going to use sharpening stone, we're going to use a grinder, something that's going to sort of sand or grind or cut the steel off of this edge, and we're going to move it back, and we're going to end up with this. Now, one of the things this illustrates nicely for us is notice that every time you sharpen your knife, and if we kept doing this, right, over time, this point is going to move further and further back. So every time we sharpen, we're taking a little bit more material off of our blade. So we don't want to be sharpening a knife all the time, and you know, it shouldn't be necessary. What we should be doing is maintaining our knives so that the edge stays fairly good, and we'll talk about doing that later by stropping. But then when we do sharpen, we don't want to take a whole lot of unnecessary material, and there's a couple of things that we need to speak about in that regard, primarily regarding angle and counting and paying attention to a burr, okay? So what we're going to do is we start. I'm not going to actually do this, but I'm going to use the Spectacle Sharp Maker to demonstrate. I would start, where's the knife? There we go. I would start taking this knife and rubbing it down this stone. The sharpened edge goes first, and this would be true. Let's imagine this was my sharpening stone. I was using a flat stone sharpener. I would do this motion. Okay, so you always are going to move the knife toward, as if you're cutting into the stone. Okay, you're going to slide it along this way. All right, now we're sliding along, or we're coming down our sharp maker, and that's going to slowly remove material from the blade of the knife. Okay, now as that material is removed, what's going to happen is, let's say I'm working on this side here. I've drawn this so that I would be. I've put a little kind of dot right here, and that represents a burr. Okay, so as you take more and more material off of this, and of course, you know, we're almost on a microscopic level here, but as we're taking material off of this, we're going to get a little burr forming. And once that burr forms, you can stop, you're done. Okay, once you've got a burr, then you need to stop, because if you go further than that, you're taking more material than you need to. And remember, we don't want to take much material. We want this knife to last a really long time. You know, it's a good knife and we've spent a lot of money on it, so we don't want to wear out the blade prematurely. Okay, so we're taking material off of this edge, and a burr is going to form. And when that burr forms, that tells you time to switch to the other side, and then you're going to do the other side again until you get a burr. Now, it's not just that simple. You need to be paying attention for the burr and checking every so often, but in working away on that edge, you need to be counting your strokes, okay? You need to count how long have I worked on this edge. And the reason for that is, you can imagine that if I work on this edge a whole lot, I'm going to use my pen to represent this, I'm slowly moving this edge over more and more. So as I move this edge over, see what's happening to the other side? It gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So if I go too far at this edge all the time, and I don't bring this edge back enough, I'm going to end up with an uneven secondary bevel, and it's not going to cut as well, and it's not going to look as nice either. Okay, so we want a nice even bevel here where both of these sides are the same angle and the same size, the same length. All right. Now, by the way, if you're assessing a knife, let's say you're thinking of buying a new knife and you're looking at it in the store, that's one of the things you should look for when you're assessing the quality and the fit and finish of a knife is this angle consistent? Are these two sides exactly the same all the way along, okay? So anyway, that's a bit of an aside there, but that's what we're trying to do. We want to be consistent. Now, when we talk about, there are two things that we want to talk about now when we talk about sharpening. Number one is this angle. All right, knives are going to come with different angles, and it's important to get that angle correct, or to make a conscious decision about it. Okay, so let's say you know what this angle is. Well, then what you want to do is make sure that you hold the knife. Okay, here's my knife. Let's imagine this is a sharpening stone here. You can see as I change the angle of the knife here, I'm changing how it interfaces with this stone. What you want to do is make sure that the angle you're using when you rub this along the stone is exactly the same as the angle that's already there, generally speaking. Now, if you know a lot about knives, and if you've used a lot of knives, and then you may want to make a decision, okay? Then you may say, hey, I like a particular angle. So a Spectacle Sharp Maker like this is set at a 40-degree inclusive angle. Maybe you prefer that, and so you reprofile all of your knives to that angle, all right? I'm going to say one other thing here about this grinding process, and it's that you need to work from the most abrasive to the least abrasive. And so essentially we're talking about, if you're familiar with woodworking, you know, we're talking about sanding. And the same is true if you're doing woodworking, right? You start with the heavy grit, the 50, the 60 grit sandpaper, and you work your way up slowly and slowly until you get to 200 or 300 or however fine you want to go. Now with metal, those numbers are far, far higher, okay? So something like this, which is fairly abrasive, or even more so, this diamond stone. Okay, so this diamond stone is fairly abrasive for knife sharpening, but in terms of an actual sandpaper, it's probably between 300 and 600. Okay, it would be already pretty fine for sandpaper. When you go up to this, and finally this, this is the super fine stone for the sharp maker. You're getting up into the thousands. Okay, so you work from the least abrasive to the most abrasive, and each time you're taking off a little bit of material. Now, let me say one more thing about how this works. I'm going to draw a little jagged edge here. So you see that little jagged line I've drawn? If you were to, under a microscope, look at the flat edge here, you would see these super, super small little lines, okay? Because think about what you're doing. When you are using an abrasive material, like sandpaper or like a sharpening stone, you're cutting with these little tiny particles, okay? And those little tiny particles are harder than steel, therefore they wear away the steel, but they wear it away. You know, if you imagine on a very microscopic level, you've got all of these little stones, like all these little particles, and you pull your knife over that, and those stones cut into the surface of your knife, leaving this sort of toothy grind, okay? And anyone who's, if you've used really coarse sandpaper, you see the lines, right? When you start rubbing, you can see those deep gouges that are left by those large, heavy, abrasive stones, okay? That's what you're doing, only on a microscopic level. So this is just as abrasive. It's just that it's the stones, the size of the grains are much, much smaller. So these little jagged edges are smaller and smaller and smaller. And so as you go more and more fine, you end up with, maybe this is your most coarse, I'm exaggerating this, but this is your most coarse, this is the next coarse, and this is the finest you go. Every time those little jagged edges get a little smaller, okay? So, because of that, you can't start with a fine stone and go to coarse. You always go from coarse to fine. All right. Now, one thing you need to consider is how fine you want to go. Okay, because a lot of guys have noticed, and probably and legitimately noticed, that sometimes this coarse grind cuts better. And you can see that this is on a microscopic level, but there'd be these microscopic serrations. So it almost looks like a serrated steak knife, and that's going to cut really, really well. Okay. For most guys who sharpen their own knives, it's a matter of pride how fine they can get that to go, okay? And you can see that this has been taken almost to a mere polish, okay? So that's a mere polish, means you've taken those lines that grind down super, super, super fine, about as fine as you can get it, all right? So we've talked about the grind. Let's talk about the angle now. So I'm holding this knife and I'm going to sharpen it. You can see how I have all these options. I could hold it like this, I could hold it like this, or like this. Now, what I need to do is hold it exactly right. So let me show you with this diagram what I mean. So here is our secondary bevel, and these orange lines represent my stone and what's going to happen if I don't keep my angle consistent. So number one, if my angle is too steep, like this, you can see I'm only going to sharpen the shoulder up here. And if I keep doing that, I'm actually going to re-profile. I'm going to change the angle of this secondary bevel. Same is true here, only if I'm too shallow, I'm only touching the tip of the secondary bevel. And now I'm going to I'm going to re-profile. I'm going to change the angle of my knife. Now you may want to re-profile a knife, okay? That's a totally different discussion. But generally speaking, you don't want to do that. And for sharpening purposes, you certainly don't want to do that. And so we need to be consistent. Now the way to do that is to use a Sharpie, all right? And I'm not going to do this because these knives are both already quite sharp, but I would take this knife, let me get to where the light's hitting it right, and you can see that secondary bevel. I would take this knife and I would draw a black line right on the secondary bevel so that the secondary bevel is all black. And then as I start sharpening, I'm going to notice that, oh hey, I'm only removing the Sharpie down here at the very apex of the angle, or I'm only removing the Sharpie back here at the shoulder. That means I've got my angle wrong and I need to adjust, okay? So angle and coarseness of the grit are both things that you need to consider in getting a nice sharp knife. So we've talked about getting a burr, we've talked about keeping a consistent angle. The other thing we need to talk about is consistent pressure and time, okay? And what I mean by that is, as I'm sharpening this knife, what I don't want to have happen is to spend a whole lot of time and really grind on this portion of the knife and not so much on this portion, or vice versa. I don't want to grind a bunch out here and not enough back here. I want to be consistent with the amount of time I spend going over the whole blade. And so when you sharpen, you need to sort of develop a rhythm so that every time is going to be about the same amount of time, and I'm going to spend the same energy, and I'm going to push with the same pressure on all the portions of this grind. Now there are some ways to do that that are more user-friendly, okay? The Sharpmaker is sort of the middle of the road. It's easier to maintain a consistent angle than it is if you just had a flat stone, okay, like this. By the way, the Sharpmaker can also be used as a flat stone, just like this, okay? If you had these stones laying in here and you sharpened your knife on that, it's basically a flat stone, all right? You put them in here like this, and now it's a fixed angle, okay? And now, so you can use it this way, you can use it that way. There are also inserts out here for sharpening different things, but this is not a review of the Sharpmaker. I'm just giving you the principle here behind all of this stuff. So what I want to make sure that I'm doing is using the same amount of pressure and the same angle all the time. And the angle needs to match the angle that already exists here on the knife. Okay, so that's the main sort of discussion about how to sharpen. Now I'm going to say this. It takes time, okay guys? You're not going to watch this video and go out and do a great job sharpening a knife. You're going to have to practice, and what will actually happen with practice, you'll develop a feel, okay? So you'll actually be able to tell when that angle is right and when it's wrong. There'll actually be, if you've got this whole surface contacting the stone, there'll be a little more friction and you'll feel the stone cutting that metal. And if you don't feel it cutting the metal quite right, that clues you in, hey, I'm getting this wrong. Okay, so the other thing I should say is if you're going to use flat stones, you can quite easily just take a piece of wood and establish a jig so that you can get your angle consistent. So a lot of guys, you know, they'll take a piece of wood, put it like this on the stone, and then they'll bring their knife, set it against that, and that sets your angle for you, and then you just keep that angle as you go across, okay? You're going to do the same coming the other way, all right? So very briefly, let's do a synopsis. I've decided to sharpen this knife. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start sharpening it this way down the stone until I develop a burr on this side. Then I'm going to switch, go ahead, sharpen this side until I develop a burr on the other side. And you can feel the burr. The best way that I usually check it is with my fingernail like this. I used to. Now I can just go like this and I can right away feel whether or not I have a burr. And again, that's going to take some practice as well. So you develop your burr. You take the burr off on both sides. You make sure that before you switch stones, there's no burr. Okay, so once I've gotten a burr on this side, I switch to this side, get a burr on that side. Then I'm going to do 3 to 5 strokes, and that's going to remove the burr on both sides. I'm going to make sure I've removed the burr on both sides. Then I'll switch these stones out for the finer stones and go through the process again. Develop a burr. The burr will be smaller, so it's going to be harder to feel with the finer stones. And then you're just going to continue that process right down. Maybe you'll go another step to the superfine stones, okay, and maybe you'll have started one step early with the very coarse stones. I rarely use these unless I'm reprofiling the blade or unless I'm dealing with super hard steel, which most of the time I'm not. I make choices about the knives I buy based on the steel, right? So We've talked about consistent angle. The last thing to mention is this, okay? This is a piece of leather, and I've put polishing compound on here that's very, very fine, far finer than even this very fine stone. And what I'm going to do at the end, and in fact, what I'm going to do almost every day that I carry a knife, I'm going to take this piece of leather and I'm going to strop this knife. Now, stropping is backwards to sharpening, okay? When I'm sharpening, I move the knife as if I'm cutting into the material. When I'm stropping, I'm going backwards, okay? And I think that's the reason for some confusion when some people look at, you see some people want to sharpen it this way, going backwards, and they don't, what they've witnessed someone else doing is likely stropping, which is done this way, rather than sharpening. And so they're going to copy what they've seen someone else doing. All right, a little bit of lock stick there. Anyway, that's how we're going to sharpen. And I hope if you've watched that now, we've talked about, we've talked about restoring this nice edge. We've talked about removing material. We've talked about keeping a consistent angle. I hope that helps, guys. If you have any questions or comments, or if you have any tips, I'd love to hear them below in the comments. Talk to you soon and have a great day.